And so I won't take up any more of your time because I know you're all anxiously waiting to hear our featured speaker. I'll call upon Carl Sagan to accept this award, and with it our deep appreciation of all that he is doing to bring about this vision. Let me just read the inscription on this plaque. To Carl Sagan, Humanist of the Year, 1981, for his influential work in educating the public in the sciences and for his pioneering efforts in space exploration and interstellar communication.
Thank you, Margaret. I can't think of anyone I'd rather receive this award from. I'm deeply grateful to all of you for this award, which means a great deal to me. I've known about the American Humanist Association for at least 20 years, since my days as an undergraduate student of H.J. Muller, who was a past recipient of this award and former president of this organization, and I'm just delighted to be here with you. I want to talk about a number of things. I had one set of things I wanted to talk about before I heard this afternoon's debate, in which Dr. LaRue did so well, and then I thought I would do quite a different presentation. But when I discovered that Margaret was going to make this introduction, I thought I'd give a third discussion. And so now I'm going to do some mix of them, but I'll try not to be very, very long-winded because I'm really anxious to get some feeling about your interests and concerns in the question period, and no matter what I say, I'm bound to have heard it before, whereas your questions are likely to be more of a surprise to me. There is an emerging vision of the cosmic context of the human species, which might be called cosmic evolution. And I want to begin by telling you about a little piece, not such a little piece, a major piece of that vision, which is due to Margaret Burbidge and her collaborators. If you examine with a spectroscope attached to an astronomical telescope the stars, the sun, the distant galaxies, the matter between the stars, disciplines which Margaret is expert in and a world leader in, you find a quite remarkable uniformity. You find that the universe is by and large made everywhere of the same stuff, and in more or less the same proportions. There are, of course, differences from place to place. There are some peculiar stars. The Earth itself is peculiar, but in ways which are easy to understand. And the regularity is this. The universe is made mostly of hydrogen and helium, and the rest of the stuff is just a tiny contribution, much less than 1%. And then the next most abundant atoms are things like carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, silicon, and then you go down the list and you get to sulfur and iron, and then you get down more and more and more. Then you come to things like dysprosium and europium and erbium and praseodymium, which we don't ordinarily bump into in everyday life. Although Margaret does. Now, the question is why? Why is the universe made of the same stuff everywhere? Well, Margaret was engaged in the 1950s in an extremely important piece of work in which she and her equally distinguished collaborators wondered about how the nuclei of atoms would be generated in the insides of hot stars. Stars called red giants, and another set of stars, the last stages of massive stars called supernovae. And they found that to a reasonable degree, if you started the universe with hydrogen and a little helium, let the matter condense into stars, let the stars cook hot on the inside, jam the atomic nuclei together, you would, in our epoch, make a distribution of atoms very much like the observed cosmic abundance of the elements. Margaret and her collaborators explained why iron is common and dysprosium rare. This is a goal which may have been dimly glimpsed by the ancient Greeks and the medieval alchemists to understand the distribution of the elements on the earth and in the cosmos, never explicitly formulated by them, but a discovery and an insight and a vision of surpassing importance, which I truly believe will be not only remembered, but will be a mainstay of the understanding of ourselves and the universe 1,000 years from now. Now, let me try to put that major discovery in a still larger context of cosmic evolution. Margaret mentioned the questions which every human culture has asked. Every culture has a creation myth. There is not a culture without it. Human beings are designed, built, evolved, whichever word you like, in such a way that understanding our origins is something that humans are driven to do. There are alternative explanations, but the emerging set of explanations goes something like this, and I will do it in the backward scheme, back into time. Where did human beings come from? If you look closely at the enormous similarities between humans and the other plants and animals on the earth, it is very clear that we are part of that biological community on our planet, not something dropped in as an afterthought. We are deeply connected in our anatomy, our physiology, our biochemistry, the structure of our heredity, the nature of our enzymes, to all the other beasts and vegetables on the planet, but most closely related to the higher primates, like the chimpanzees. And by this argument, but also by the clear testimony of the fossil record, imperfect as it is, it's clear that humans and chimpanzees have recently evolved in the last few million years, certainly less than 10 million years, from a common ancestor who, if you bumped into on the street, you would think was an ape rather than a human. And we all know, although there are many youngsters in this country today who do not know and are not learning about the sequence of events which leads backwards from the primates to the other mammals to reptiles, amphibians, fish, invertebrates, colonial organisms made of a set of single cells, a single-celled organism, and probably to the first form of life which was something like a free-floating, fairly simple molecular complex like DNA, or as H.J. Muller liked to call it, the naked gene. Now, where did that come from? Here, of course, the further back into the past we go, the less able we are to do experiments, the more difficult is the question, the more tentative must be our answers. Nevertheless, it is a remarkable fact that you can make all of the essential building blocks of life, the components of the proteins, the components of the nucleic acids, by simply mixing together a molecular mixture made of the atoms which are most abundant, the very ones I mentioned before. Hydrogen, helium if you like, although it doesn't chemically interact, carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen, Because of an excess of hydrogen, these are present in the forms of methane, ammonia, water, and if you put such a mixture of gases in a bottle, supply an energy source strong enough to break the chemical bonds, and let the molecular fragments, which are called free radicals, not a political remark, recombine, those free radicals recombine to make all the essential building blocks of life. Now that's not the same as making life, but it is certainly a significant step towards it, and by the way, the fact that it is so easy, that it requires the most common materials and the most general energy sources, means that this is almost certainly not a process restricted to the Earth, but rather something which happens in lots of places during lots of epochs of cosmic time. Okay, so origin of life. But the life on the Earth happened on the Earth. Where did the Earth come from? You recognize we're going through the long regression, which you've probably had in discussions in high school and college dormitories. Oh yeah, well where did that one come from? Oh yeah, well where did that one come from? And the person who's asking those questions hopes you will eventually bump into an impenetrable wall and be forced by dint of lack of imagination, if nothing else, to say that God did it. So I'm on my way. The Earth and the other planets, we have good reason to think, formed out of a common interstellar cloud of gas and dust made of just the common stuff between the stars some 4.5 to 5 billion years ago. And we can observe today stars, for example, in the Orion Nebula, which you can see with the naked eye. The middle star is not actually a star in the sword that, if you go for these psychological projective tests that they teach about what constellations are which, that cloud is filled with extremely young stars that are in the process of forming today and provide observational evidence against the contention that everything in the universe was made at the beginning and nothing was made later. Just look at the Orion Nebula. There are stars being born in a very jolly fashion, not knowing that there are people on Earth who have proscribed their formation. The vast complex of stars and interstellar clouds and planets that we see with the naked eye is called the Milky Way galaxy, and that galaxy is perhaps 8 or 10 billion years old, and it formed probably from some much larger intergalactic cloud of gas and dust. And there, since the heavy elements, the ones heavier than hydrogen and helium, are cooked in the insides of stars, a la Margaret, early in the history of the universe had to be made mainly of hydrogen and helium. If you make that assumption, you can then understand where we are today. And then, by running the expanding universe backwards into time, asking when all the galaxies were very close together, the event called the Big Bang, you find that some remarkable event happened some maybe 15 or 20 billion years ago. The chronology is still a little uncertain. Remember, we're at the furthest remove. It's toughest to figure things out there. Now, the big question. Where did it all come from? The standard religious answer, well, only in the West, of course. In the East, not only are there different questions, but there are very different answers. But in the West, it's God did it. And this is generally considered to be an acceptable answer. The next question of where did God come from is usually answered, God was always here. If you then say, what about the possibility that the universe was always here and God isn't needed, or at least is unemployed, that is considered, but clearly on emotional grounds only, as an unacceptable answer. But it is, without going into too many details, it is an observational, it is within our observational capability to determine whether the universe will in the future continue to expand forever, or the expansion will slow down, stop, be followed by a contraction, and something bad happens long after that. If we do live in an oscillating universe, then it is extremely unlikely that we live in the first moment of the beginning of an oscillating universe, that the universe has not in fact been oscillating for an infinite amount of time. If that turns out to be the case, then of course there is no need to understand the origin, since the universe was always here. So we're faced with two counterintuitive alternatives, neither of which seems intuitively satisfactory, but why would we expect that our intuition has any relevance on questioning this matter? Namely, either the universe is infinitely old, or it was made from nothing by some event which is beyond our ability to plumb. And you don't have to make up your mind right now. It's all right to wait until the data are in. Unlike the usual procedure in matters of this sort, to make up your mind first and then suppress the data, it is probably much better to keep an open mind, and then when the data is in, right, then it's easy. You just decide what the evidence shows. I'd like to go on, but I had understood that there were going to be no television cameras for my talk, and I see television cameras on and the lights on. So could we have television cameras off and the lights down? And then I'll be glad to continue. Thank you. It's okay. No, it doesn't matter. It's mainly the audience I wanted to see, which is hard to do with the... Of course, now the microphone is off also. It's either or, eh? If I want to be heard, I have to have the television cameras on, huh? Well, I'll yell until the microphone gets fixed.
They're cute.
Is this a technical problem beyond the... You can? Okay, I'll keep going. Now, this... Okay. Now the lights are on, but the microphone is off. Now, if you can just invert that switch. A, B, C, D. It is a commonplace to give a talk in a physics department where the professor of acoustics is working on this and the professor of optics is working on the slide projector. So there's no reason for the American Humanist Association to feel bad that nothing works. This perspective of cosmic evolution, I believe, is grand and stimulating and rousing, and I believe resonates with our deepest religious feelings, the sorts of feelings that have led, to the traditional religions. The concern that is embraced in those creation myths that every culture has. And I believe that one of the reasons for the unexpected popularity of the Cosmos television series is that it presented a still not fully worked out, but scientifically supported and beautiful scheme of cosmic evolution. We, of course, didn't invent it. In Cosmos, we merely presented it. Margaret Burbage is one of the many astronomers and geologists and biologists and physicists responsible for that grand perspective. People like it. It's very clear from the mail. We have gotten some 4,000 letters. I've read something like half of them. And I can tell you that there is an enormous interest in this cosmic perspective that is clearly, from the letters, not being presented in the public schools or by the mass media. And another aspect of Cosmos, which by the way has been by far the most widely watched series in the history of public television in the United States, is its assumption that the viewer would have no trouble understanding what it's about. People, it turns out, are far more intelligent than the opinions of middle-level publishing house executives and television producers might lead you to believe. And should we have expected anything different? We are a scientific species. Science is part of our heredity. When our ancestors brachiated from branch to branch, let's imagine two populations of our primate ancestors living in the treetops. One who thought it was an extremely difficult job to calculate the trajectory from this branch to that, and the other population that thought it was dead easy. The first population, let's say the ones who thought that you had to calculate it with the Chebyshev polynomials in the course of leaping from branch to branch, don't complete the calculation by the time the branch arrives, and they fall to the ground and are not heard from again. They leave few offspring. The ones who have a grasp of Newtonian physics, even if only intuitive, they make it to the branch and leave descendants. We are descended from the guys who figured it out. And going back through the 4 billion year history of life on the Earth, we are descended from the ones who, on many fundamental levels, understood their environment, were in resonance with that environment. That's the way evolution has made us. The ones who aren't in resonance die. So of course science is natural for us. And the idea that it's only for a small elite, for a privileged few who have the time, inclination, and by the way, money to spend 10 or 15 years preparing is simply wrong. It is the birthright of every human being to understand science, and it's essential if we are to control, particularly in a democracy, a future which depends so clearly on science and technology. Also, it's enormous fun. Socrates said that, and by the way, he's not someone who we give complete uncritical praise to, if you've seen the Cosmos, said that the greatest of human pleasures was to know a deep thing well. And I believe science provides that pleasure. And even if you can think of a pleasure that's maybe one higher on the list, that knowing a deep thing well must be high up in the list of the deepest and most satisfying human experiences. The idea that science is only for scientists deprives the rest of the human community of that pleasure. Suppose someone said that sex was only for scientists. I don't think many people would accept that rule. Why should the idea that science is only for scientists be accepted? Or indeed, why shouldn't everybody on some level feel that science is accessible, part of the way they view the world? It is, of course, on many practical circumstances. When you buy a used car, you do not say, "Yes, sir, I believe everything you're saying," to the used car salesman. You kick the tire, you look at the odometer, you inquire whether the federal government has removed the restrictions against tampering with the odometer, as they're just about to do. You look in the hood, you maybe bring along a friend who knows about automobile engines. Well, when you're exercising that skeptical métier, you are being a scientist. That's all it's about. It's figure things out, see how they fit together, be willing to do something quantitative, do not accept the words of people who call themselves authorities, make sure that the claims are valid. Well, that's all that science asks. And nevertheless, there are many other areas in which analogs of used car salesmen try to sell us goods, and we are not as vigilant as we ought to be in asking the difficult, perhaps the embarrassing questions. Which brings me to creationism. One of the claims of the so-called creationists is that they just want fair play, that they don't want one view, which for some reason which I can't understand, they've credited all you people for. When I first read their stuff, I didn't know who the secular humanists were. It turned out it was just you guys. I think we all agree that fair play is important, and that if there were only one view being presented to the bulk of Americans, that is an evil which ought to be undone. But let us look a little more closely at what the evil is. Every Sunday, all over America, on many different channels, it is possible to see the representatives of one view presenting their opinion. How many programs are there on Darwin compared to how many programs there are on the account in the first chapter of Genesis? The preponderance is by far, just in national media, by far towards the creationists. If they were truly concerned with equal time, I think that would be terrific. The first thing that they would do would be to preach Darwin from the pulpit. Another aspect of equal time is the claim, which we heard this afternoon, that evolution is only a theory. Now, the word theory in science has a different meaning from what it means in everyday parlance, which is a half-baked idea that somebody got in getting up this morning. It's only a theory. The atomic theory is taught today. That's what it's called. It doesn't mean that atoms were something thought up a week ago Tuesday, and we have yet to determine whether there's any good evidence for the existence of atoms. A theory is a comprehensive view of which explains and summarizes and condenses an enormous body of observational data. It is not written on tablets which are immutable. New facts can change theories, and it happens all the time in science. But a thing called a theory, like the gravitational theory, the atomic theory, the nuclear theory, those are very well developed and extremely well supported bodies of knowledge. Now, I would even, in the interest of fair play, be happy to accept the appellation theory in its sort of everyday use for evolution if the creationists were willing to talk about the God theory, the God hypothesis. It might be right. It's certainly possible, particularly a God who is sufficiently remote in the scheme of causality, who does not intervene in everyday life. It is perfectly possible that something called God, I don't know exactly what it is, set things in motion and established the physical laws some 15 or 20 billion years ago. There's no compelling evidence for it. There is no compelling evidence against it. It's a hypothesis. I believe that if we were to use words like hypothesis and theory in an equitable manner, in this confrontation, we would be in fine shape. The trouble is, when the well-established bodies of knowledge of science are given this slightly pejorative use of the word theory, and the Babylonian cosmology, which is enshrined in the book of Genesis, is not called a theory or a hypothesis. That's an inequity. Now, let me give just one confrontation, there are an enormous number of them, between astronomical knowledge and creationist dogma. The creationists believe that humans and all the plants and animals and the earth and the entire universe are less than 10,000 years old. Remember, Archbishop Usher's chronology was 4004 BC, about 6,000 years ago. Let's round it off to 10,000. Where do they get that number from? It's by adding up the begats. A begat B, B begat C. Every one of them is given a lifetime, usually 711 and a quarter years. And all you have to do is add them up to some event in historical times, David or Jesus or somebody whose time is otherwise authenticated, and you come back to something like 4000 BC. Now, why? Why do creationists care whether the world is 10,000 years old or 4 billion or, why not believe the world is 4.5 billion years old? But all the rest of the things they believe is true. Well, I think the reason is clearly that they wish to believe in the literal truth of the Bible, with no room for interpretation, which of course gets them into some severe trouble. Now, this view, enshrined in the first account in the book of Genesis, which is different from and inconsistent with the second account of creation of the world in the book of Genesis, the Jews learned from the best scientists of the time during the Babylonian captivity around 600 BC. It was state of the art in 600 BC. It's just that some things have been learned since then. Also, by the way, around 600 BC was the time of Thales in Miletus, when a completely different tradition, that of the Ionians, which we talk about in Cosmos, was developing, which in fact was very much the path towards modern science until it was squelched a few hundred years later. In a way, it's only an accident that it's the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian cosmology, rather than the view of Thales, which is in the book of Genesis. If the Jews had been brought into captivity in the Eastern Mediterranean, there would have been a very different story. Now, there is a set of mutually coherent, beautifully simple, and with only a few exceptions, marvelously consistent approaches to the age of the Earth. It's called radioactive dating. And it gives a perfectly consistent view that the Earth is about 4.5 billion years old. A piece of rock called a meteorite falls from the sky, you use just the same technique, you find it's 4.5 billion years old. You send guys to the moon, they bring back pieces of the moon, you find the moon is 4.5 billion years old. You use the best modern astrophysical theory about the evolution of the sun, and you find it is something like 5 billion years old. And you look at all the craters on planets, and you know the population of objects that make holes in planetary surfaces. Today, and you say, at the present rate of making holes, how long would it have been to make all those holes I can count? It's about 4 or 5 billion years. It all fits together beautifully. The whole solar system was made 4 or 5 billion years ago. If the creationists are right, all that data fitting together so perfectly, consistent with everything else we know, has to be wrong. Not only does it have to be wrong, it has to be a false trail. It has to be data placed there to confuse us. In fact, it has to be a breach of the ninth commandment. What are our minds for? If you believed in the traditional God, why were we given minds which permit us to figure this out if the end product is just to fool us? That's a kind of nasty God. And now let's take a related point. Light travels at, guess what, the speed of light. Okay, it's the fastest thing we know. When we look at the sun, we do not see it as it is today. We see it 8 minutes ago in the past because it's 8 light minutes away. That's how long it takes light to get from the sun to us. When we look at Jupiter or Saturn, we're looking at a few light hours away. When we're looking at the nearest stars, we're looking at a few light years away. When we're looking at the center of the galaxy, we're looking 30,000 light years away. That means that that light set out on its journey to us 30,000 years ago. Say the creationists. There wasn't any universe 30,000 years ago. There's something wrong with that data. Now, the nearest galaxy like our own is a little more than 2 million light years away. You can look at it. Margaret has in fact studied it. Its rotation. It has enormous structure. You can see bright stars and ionized gas clouds around bright stars in this nearest galaxy. Yet, the creationists must conclude that all of that light, giving this lovely detailed image, is not setting out from an actual physical object out there, but was set into motion towards the Earth by God 10,000 years ago to fool us. Now, if we look at where most of the light in the universe is, it's in those external galaxies. Most of the energy in the universe is, in the standard astronomical view, more than 10,000 light years away. If the creationists are right, God created most of the matter and energy in the universe for the sole purpose of fooling human beings. I don't see any escape from that conclusion. The creationists are forced to conclude, they don't acknowledge it, that the God they believe in is not only malevolent, but has dedicated most of his energy in creating the universe for the single purpose of deceiving human beings. What kind of God do they believe in? Now, if the teaching of biological evolution is successfully challenged, and it doesn't have to be done in every state, because of the profit motive in the publishing business, you have only to convince a few states, Texas, say, or California, that you shouldn't teach evolution, and the textbook manufacturers will change their texts, and all the other states will willy-nilly have to follow unless some major effort is made to find obscure textbooks. So there is a real danger that a generation of American youngsters will grow up not only ignorant of biological evolution, the Darwinian insight, one of the great scientific ideas of all time, but afraid of it, having a vague sense that there's something unclean about it. Now, at the same time, this country and many others are pursuing an extremely interesting, not without some peril, but an extremely interesting long-term investigation of what is sometimes called genetic engineering, work on recombinant DNA. And the potential human benefits from it are enormous, including plentiful supplies of insulin, the development of interferon and other molecules of conceivable great importance in treating dread diseases, microbes to eat up oil spills, the precision designing of microorganisms to do things for us. Now what happens if we get a generation of youngsters who are uncomfortable with the entire perspective of biological evolution and molecular biology? We then will have few people and fewer competent people working in this field, which requires great care, because it is clearly possible by accident or even by design to make microbes which will do bad things as well as good things. This is one of many examples of how depriving youngsters of that birthright, that scientific birthright I talked about before, has serious dangers to the nation and, because of the high state of science and technology in the United States, to the world. If the United States declines precipitously in the major sciences, the world, as well as the United States, suffers. And let's take another example. The intolerance and ignorance of the creationists towards other cultures. It is astonishing that in all this pleas for equal time, we don't hear from them a plea for the Buddhist or the Hindu view of creation, which is, of course, very different, more consistent, by the way, with that infinitely old oscillating universe than the Big Bang made from nothing. We hear nothing about other views which might be alleged to have an equal claim to validity as the Babylonian cosmology in Genesis, let's say the ancient astronaut views of Erich von Däniken. That's a view. It has no evidence to support it, but it's a view. Bought, by the way, by 40 million people. That's the sales of von Däniken's books. Should not von Däniken be taught in the schools? Should not Native American cosmologies be taught in the schools? Should not West African cosmologies be taught in the schools? Should not Polynesian cosmologies be taught in the schools? Are we talking about the teaching of science, or are we talking about the teaching of creation myths of many cultures, each of which represents a dignified and courageous attempt by people of pre-scientific age to understand the universe around them? Now, the sense that it's just science and fundamentalist Christianity and there's nothing else in the world is dangerous for another reason. Because we are moving into a time when the United States cannot, even if it wished, and it certainly has wished, cannot dominate the rest of the world. It's essential for us to understand other cultures, other religions, other ways of life. When Annie and I went to Japan for Cosmos, we encountered questions about how Cosmos fit into Buddhist religious views, Japan being a Buddhist nation. The implicit teaching that there are no other cultures worth mentioning, that there are no other religions with equal claims to validity, equal scholarship, equal historical importance, equal poetic significance, is not only a deprivation in a profound human and educational sense, it is dangerous for the future of this country. And in general, the idea that we must accept arguments from authority, that we must memorize by rote, is an encouragement to stop doing the one thing which humans are better than any other plant and animal on the planet in doing, and that is thinking. We are a thinking species. That's the only thing we're good at. We're not faster than the other animals. We're not better camouflaged. We're not stronger. We're only smarter. And sometimes we outsmart ourselves. Certainly many of the problems, list as long as my arm, everyone knows them, are concerned with the misapplication, the misuse of science and technology. Nevertheless, If you think about any of those issues, environmental pollution, the threat of nuclear war, all the rest of it, there is no conceivable solution apart from science and technology. We must have that general understanding of science and technology to survive. The creationist onslaught is, even if it were logically meritorious, which it clearly is not, would be extremely dangerous for the future of this country and this planet. I think it's very clear that there is no society on the planet today which is optimized for, say, the middle of the 21st century. We grew up in different ages, when there were different criteria of success, when different things were required of nations. All that is changing very rapidly. And the only way, since there is clearly no theory of predictive value about how to organize major societies, you have to be willing to experiment. You have to be willing to consider many different alternatives. In other words, you have to embrace in the social, economic, and political sphere the scientific approach. Now, if at the same time we are being taught, generation of bright youngsters is being taught not to question, not to think for yourself, only to go to the traditional values, by the way, that tradition goes back less than 0.1% of human history. It's traditional only if you, as Margaret said, are myopic and have tunnel vision. That poses enormous dangers. Instead, we need the kind of attitudes that as far as I understand, the American Humanist Association has always been dedicated to: courageous questioning, the best possible intellectual effort to understand what the world in fact is, as opposed to what we wish it to be, compassion for other human beings, a devotion to the entire human species and not just to one subset of it. In other words, a planetary perspective, which in the broadest sense comes out of the vision of a cosmic evolution. Thank you very much.